Welcome to our final lesson from the book Playing with Fire. This is chapter 13, and the title of the chapter is Living Expectantly, Revelation. Whether it is a movie, a play, or a book, all of us want to know one thing, and it's this: how does it end? If I were asked to describe the Bible in one single sentence, it would be this: the Bible is the story of God's redeeming of humanity after the fall to restore it to its original factory setting as seen in the Garden of Eden. If this is the Bible story, then the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ to the Apostle John is the end of the story. If we want to know how God's story ends, we have to read this book. Now, at the end of the story goes something like this, and there are pictures of it from page 252 of the book. We're going to see what happens to all of the powerful kingdoms of the world. We see what happens to the armies that are opposed to God. We see how it ends for all people, both for those who love God and His Son, but also for those who have rejected Jesus Christ. Interestingly enough, Revelation is probably the least read of all the books of the Bible, and yet it is the only book with this promise for those who read it. Revelation chapter 1, verse 3 says this: "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near." The theme of the book is to encourage believers to overcome in the midst of whatever persecutions and difficulties we may be having. Now we have to talk about genre. The genre of Revelation is a little bit different. It's a combination of apocalyptic, prophetic, and epistle. Apocalyptic appears in the ancient world usually during times of oppression and persecution. Apocalyptic literature is in highly symbolic language, and this is to protect both the writer and the readers from persecutors. The symbolic language also helps to communicate the truths of the revelation from unbelievers and to reveal them to believers. The best example of Old Testament apocalyptic literature can be found in the prophetic sections of the book of Daniel. That would be chapters 7 through 12. Usually apocalyptic literature is tied to historical events. In the case of Revelation, it was written during the persecution by Emperor Domitian around the end of the first century. John was exiled for his Christian faith to the island of Patmos, and that's off the western coast of Asia Minor, which is now the country of Turkey. Now, John is given a series of visions that contain glimpses of the future. Perhaps you've heard people express the idea that the God of the Old Testament is judgmental, while the God of the New Testament is a God of grace. We cannot read the book of Revelation and come away with that theology, or the idea of Jesus as simply meek and mild. Now, there are four classic interpretations of the book of Revelation. These are approaches that people use. On pages 256 to 257 of the book, there are arguments for and against each one. We would invite you to consider them all. However, as we'll see, there is a recommended approach, which we'll share in a moment. Again, there are four approaches. The first is what they call the allegorical approach. And that's where the book is just one great allegory about good and evil, which are represented in every historical era. Therefore, the symbols and the events are not tied to any particular historical events. The second view is called the preterist approach. In this approach, Revelation is a record of conflicts in the early church between Judaism and paganism in the first century. All events in the book are assumed to have already taken place. The third approach is what's called the historical approach. Revelation is said to be a picture of the continuous history of the church from the time of the first century until the second coming of Jesus Christ at the end of all time. And the final approach is what's called the futurist approach. The events described in chapters 4 through 22 of Revelation were future to the author, and they still await fulfillment to us. This is the most literal interpretation of the specific prophecies of the book. Because of this, we consider the futurist approach to be the one to be followed in this chapter. Just as an aside, this is the approach that Rolling Hills Covenant Church takes to the book as well. Now, here are some guidelines for being spiritually formed by the book of Revelation. Number one, don't shy away from the book of Revelation because of its distinctive genre. Apocalyptic literature does take getting used to, but there are some things that we can do to facilitate the reading. First, without exception, the symbols are interpreted for us in the text itself. Secondly, remember that this book is ultimately about Jesus Christ, not Satan, the Antichrist, or even us. Third, because Revelation is large part a prophetic word to the church, we will experience exhortation to holy living as we await Jesus' triumph. As one person has said regarding this book, be ready, be holy. Fourth, Revelation is about the end of history. It is not meant to be surrealistic or unrealistic. It gives us a very realistic glimpse of the future that informs our moral choices today. You know, Revelation is filled with over 300 Old Testament references. If you want to understand Revelation, you have to be a student of the Old Testament. With that background, we understand the book to be a capstone of all of Scripture. Revelation completes the picture of what God is doing in human history. And in conclusion, as we said at the beginning of this lesson, if all of history is guiding itself to God's restoration of the Garden of Eden, this is the book that assures us regarding how it will come about. Don't shortchange yourself and miss out on God's encouraging conclusion to history and what is in fact His story.